Welcome everybody to another episode of IGN Unfiltered. It is our monthly interview show where I am very pleased to get to sit down with the best, brightest, most interesting minds in the video game industry. And my subject this month I should say, Steve Gaynor. Steve, you are the co-founder of Fulbright, previously at 2K, BioShock series, Gone Home, Tacoma. We're going to get to all of it. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me as your subject. I prefer
Yes.
that to guest. I feel like I'm part of a science experiment, which is very good.
Yeah, I guess at Disneyland you'd be the guest, but here you're just a subject. I'm here to analyze you. No, I mean it's you've had an incredible career, which I think, you know, you're an indie developer, and that does, you know, some people think that's a bad thing. Like, no, that's because it's, you know, you're not making AAA.
Right.
$30 million games, but no, you make some of the most creative, interesting stuff out there.
Thank you.
Most recently, Tacoma, which is out now on PC and Xbox One,
Yeah.
getting excellent reviews.
Thank you.
But of course, I always love to start at the beginning because the beginning of the story helps inform the rest of the story. So, were you always a gamer your whole life, or did you come to it late?
No, I mean I don't remember a time that I wasn't playing video games. I grew up with Commodore 64
Nice.
in my room. So, you know, I was playing, I remember playing Godzilla and Muppets games on the Commodore 64, and then pretty early on I became a Nintendo gamer. I had an NES when I was a kid. I had a next door neighbor, like, I was really lucky because I had a next door neighbor who was like, I think 4 years older than me, and he was just like a classic 80s nerd. Like, he literally had Star Wars bed sheets, like the full
thing,
nine, right?
yeah.
And so he was a little older than me and kind of like got into, you know, he was like, he got Nintendo and he got Nintendo games and I played them at his house and I was like, I want one of those. So like I kind of had somebody aside from just, because I'm an only child, so I didn't have like older siblings or anything, but I had kind of that person that was like, check this out, check that out.
That's cool because kids, you know, don't often play with kids 4 years younger than you. That's cool that you had that neighborhood friendship going on.
Well, there's the whole like, you know, like next door neighbor thing. I kind of put that into Gone Home in one point where I was like, when you're a kid, your next door neighbor is kind of like your default friend. It's just like the next closest kid. But like I was really lucky to have somebody that I could kind of learn about that stuff from. You know, he was like, you know, D&D, Monty Python, all that, all that cool guy stuff.
So when the 16-bit era rolls around, Genesis kid or Super NES kid?
SNES kid.
SNES kid.
I was Nintendo all the way until I got a PlayStation. Yeah, PlayStation 1 when it came out as well.
Nice.
Yeah. I remember it was at my, God, what would it have been? Probably 13th birthday. We rented a PlayStation from Blockbuster because Blockbuster and renting consoles were both things that used to exist.
I rented a Dreamcast when that came out.
I rented a Saturn and I played Virtua Cop on it. But yeah, when it came out, we rented it and we got a copy of Loaded, which was an ultra-violent top-down.
I don't remember that one.
It was like a twin-stick shooter, kind of. Anyway, and Resident Evil 1. And that was the one that we were like, all right, we're getting scared by zombies all night at this birthday party.
So when you're doing your asterisk, comma 8, comma 1 action on Commodore, if I'm remembering Commodore usage properly.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you had to load. Yeah, God, yeah. Syntax error. I had a lot of syntax errors in my youth.
Yeah. Did you start dabbling in trying to edit or make your own stuff at any point, or were you just playing at that point?
I remember that I did. I know that like people that were kind of just like half a generation older than me, I feel like there were people who got into programming or game development by like reading, like they used to have computing magazines that would just have code printed out in the back of it and you could copy it in and run it and kind of make your own stuff. I wasn't quite there because I was too young. I remember once my dad and I bought like a how to program a game book, and I think we got as far as like programming like a smiley face to show up on screen or something. I was not dedicated enough when I was like 6 years old.
Yeah.
But a little later, I think the first, actually something that was really, so I was gonna say the first like making my own games stuff that I did was like doing BASIC, you know, like the basic programming language to make like text adventures or whatever. But actually, there were some NES games that like had level editors, and I remember using those for make your own tracks for Excitebike. And there was also Wrecking Crew Do you remember this game?
I don't remember that one. I was an NES kid too.
Yeah, no, it was pretty obscure, but it was actually a Mario game. But the premise was there were like these skyscrapers or like, you know, kind of like buildings that were like made of blocks with like ladders. It was sort of a little bit Donkey Kongish. They're like platforms with ladders and bricks and then enemies that would move across them and stuff. And I think you were playing as Mario and you had like a sledgehammer and so you could break the bricks and you would do it to clap stuff on the enemies. I don't know, whatever. But you could like use the editor to like place tiles and make your own boards and stuff. So I think that those kinds of things were were my first introduction to like making your own video game stuff. And then I got into the first like real stuff that I made was similarly they shipped the build engine level editor with Duke Nukem 3D. So like I made a very extensive Duke Nukem 3D level in my teens.
Deathmatch multiplayer levels, right?
I actually made a single player level.
Nice, nice.
Because they shipped, you know, you could place any enemies, power-ups, any scripting. I made like, I don't know, swinging doors and like a bunch of scripted stuff where enemies would come out and like, that was also where I learned my first lessons about like backing up your work. Because at some point, I like tried to put something in and just hit save and it just crashed and then would never load again. So I was like, well, first video game level I've ever made, not getting that back.
Yeah, I did a few Doom WADs back in the day.
Yeah, yeah.
And I wish I still had them.
Yeah, for sure.
I so wish I did, but so it sounds like were your parents pretty supportive of your computer tinkering desires?
Yeah, my dad worked for AT&T, and so I think he was really into the whole like kids that are growing up like are gonna need to have computer skills. So that was why I like had a Commodore 64 in our house.
That's
and I, you know, like he and I would play like I don't know, Carmen Sandiego and stuff together on his IBM PC. So yeah, it was something that I think my parents really were sort of like, this is something that we should have around, and
That's
it kind of
fantastic.
led into game stuff and all sorts of avenues, I guess.
So what did you originally want to be when you grew up? Was it always, you know, game designer, want to get into games, or was there another version of?
Well, I remember, so like my dreams came true. I remember it was when I played for whatever reason, I remember it was when I was playing Final Fantasy 1, which I had rented from the local video store, which is like, renting Final Fantasy games at a video store is just like a recipe for sadness because you're never getting that save back. Like
That's right.
But I was playing it and like I had a subscription to Nintendo Power, and like the manual in the Nintendo Power had a lot of like the beautiful Yoshitaka Amano art in it and stuff. I remember I was like probably 6 or 7 years old, and I also was big into, you know, kids are into like construction machinery and like that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I remember telling my mom, I was like, I either want to be a house builder or I think my exact phrasing was like, do drawings for Nintendo games, which translates into make video games. And then fast forward, and I made a game about being in a house, and I built that house. So I'll take it. I think I got there.
Yeah, check. Check. Mom, are you proud of me? Are you from Portland? Because I know you're there now. I know you went to college there.
Right. No, my wife is from Portland, so that's why I ended up there. I grew up in the Midwest and then moved to Florida when I was like 9. My family moved to Florida when I was 9 or 10. I wasn't like, see you, Mom and Dad, I'm headed to Florida. Here it's sunny down there. But yeah, no, I moved to Oregon when I was like 19.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I'm kind of curious why, you know, Portland is. San Francisco is a big hotbed for game development.
Yeah.
Austin, Seattle.
Sure.
Portland, it seems like there's kind of a fairly small indie community there. Yeah. It seems like, you know, such an amazing area with so much creativity in general in Portland. How come it seems like the game development community should be bigger in Portland than it is.
I mean, I think it is growing slowly, which is cool to see. Because when we moved there, I mean, part of why we started our own studio in Portland was because I wanted to move, my wife and I just wanted to move back to Portland. Like, it's where we wanted to end up, and it's where our family is from. So we did that. But, you know, having come off of, you know, working on the BioShock series and kind of having that background, moving to Portland, you can't just really submit some level design resumes and like get a job, you know? Like I did a little bit of like contract work, but if you want to like at that time, especially if I wanted to do the thing I was doing, it's like you kind of have to start your own thing.
Yeah.
And since then, like Night Dive Studios, who are in town, brought back System Shock 2 and a bunch of other older games, and now they're making like the System Shock remake, and that's kind of getting bigger. And also the Portland Indie Game Squad, or the Pig Squad colloquially, is a group that hosts a lot of like game jams and events for local game developers to get together and kind of collaborate on stuff. So it's grown a lot in the 5 years since we've been back, but that's relatively speaking, right? Because places like Seattle or LA or San Francisco, I feel like they really have these hubs of these huge businesses that bring a lot of people together, and then they start splintering off, right? Like Valve was founded by an ex-Microsoft, by Gabe Newell, ex-Microsoft, and like Microsoft kind of pulls in all of these people, and then it spreads. Or here in San Francisco, there's Silicon Valley and there's LucasArts, and those kinds of things. And Portland has both Nike and Intel are kind of headquartered on like the periphery of Portland, but there hasn't ever been that huge like software tech magnet there, and so it's
super
really
grassroots,
right? It's built from the ground up instead of this one big monolith that starts to kind of expand from there.
Yeah. So I mean, you kind of almost answered my next question. It sounds like the community the game development community that is in Portland is fairly close.
Yeah. I mean, we are. I feel like we kind of have crossed paths with practically everybody in Portland who makes games on some level, and it is like those kind of community events that happen that are really great for that. But I think that it's a little easier to have that close-knit, we're all in this together kind of feeling when you don't have like hundreds or thousands of people that are all involved. You're kind of like, oh yeah, here we are, we're in Portland, we're trying to do our thing. So it's really cool.
If I've got my timing correct, my dates correct here, you got your start in the games business as a QA tester at Sony back in 2006.
2005.
2005. Okay, so the PS3 is gearing up to launch.
Right. It was it was before the PS3. I think that when I worked there, they were like they're like, we're gonna get PS3 units in soon, basically. So I was a PSP and PS2 tester.
Nice. So what were some? How was your experience there? What did you learn? Like, sort of, did it? I mean, it clearly didn't scare you out of making games. It went the other way. But yeah, what was it like? Because we get that question a lot. I'm sure you get the question a lot. Is how do I get into making games?
Yeah.
And a lot of times, a lot of things I hear from devs and just from looking at people's experiences, QA seems to be a good foot in the door way to get in. So yeah,
I assume it still can be. It certainly was 12 years ago.
Can you share some of your experiences from stuff you learned working, getting your foot in the door that way?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing that was really valuable about doing certification QA, and certification QA is specifically like a game is finished or almost finished, and the developers send it in to make sure that it can be released on the platform, as opposed to kind of like internal or development QA, where it's really about like, we're building this game and we're testing it as we go and kind of adding in features.
You're making sure that people's profiles don't get wiped out by some crazy bug. Right?
Yeah, and especially when I was working there, it was like, what happens when you pull the memory card out while it's saving? All that kind of stuff, right?
You're never supposed to do that,
accurate. You should not have done that. That's part one. Part two, does it blow up your entire PlayStation? Because if it does, then we got a problem. But since it was that kind of testing, it meant that we got put on a new game every week or two, at the longest usually. And so as someone just getting into thinking about design and game development and how this stuff works, it was really interesting to basically, I think that's something as game players, we tend to, we're very self-selecting. We're kind of like, I'm going to play what I've heard is good, or the kinds of games I like, or my friend told me that I should check it out. And so you tend to play better stuff, or stuff that you more naturally would be interested in. And working in Cert QA means they're just sort of like, play this for a week, beat this like a dozen times, and it doesn't matter what it is.
Yeah.
And so it was a really interesting exposure to kind of like, here's this kind of game I would never normally play, and now I kind of see how it works and functions and relates to other stuff. Or even more interesting than that, like, here's kind of the knockoff version of a game that I do like, that I have played before, and I can kind of see why it worked in the thing that I'm into, and then here's this other stuff that kind of contains all the same parts, but why doesn't it come together? Or, you know, like you have those points of reference that you might not have otherwise, unless you're a game reviewer, and you're like, hey, you got to review this. What is it? Doesn't matter. Like, play it through it. Yeah, give it. And I think that is something that's like really valuable, actually, for not just thinking of game design in terms of like the best and the brightest and your favorites.
So it sounds like you started to develop kind of a, you know, like an X-ray vision.
Yeah.
You could sort of see through a game into its pieces and how it's supposed to work.
Or see it like reflected in other games. So you're sort of like, oh, here's the same like mechanic or the same feature.
Right.
But the very polished or the better tuned version works for these reasons or whatever. Also, just after I was in QA at Sony, I was in QA internally at a developer on a game that was in like mid-development, which is a totally different experience, but also really valuable for just seeing what the process is like and how the finished thing gets on screen, what it looks like when it's like very early or when something is new, and being able to just kind of know how to communicate within a development team and know what the different departments are and kind of be exposed to what making a game is before you have to be making part of it.
So it sounds like you very much would recommend that as a path to somebody looking to break in.
Potentially,
there's a lot of valuable experience to be mined there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot more options now, honestly, than there were when I started. I think QA can still be really valuable, and I know
dev tools have gotten so prevalent and a lot easier to use in general,
right?
That
yeah.
you can even kind of just start diving in yourself.
You can totally start making your own stuff. You can start working in a much smaller studio with a smaller group of people, or you can get into QA at a publisher or a large studio. I think the biggest thing is just what you're attracted to as a player. You know, and as a player, I was coming from being the PC and console game player and kind of being like, I want to make want to work on these big games. Like, how do you get closer to doing that? And QA, at a big company can totally be a path towards getting closer to actually making part of these kind of huge experiences that come out.
Yeah. So you were making your own levels for Fear.
That's right.
The first-person shooter Fear at home. So you clearly continued your build engine self-tutorial and moved into the 3D, because that's where it lost me. Like I had a blast. I think it was Doom Ed I used to make the Doom wands.
Right.
But that was all 2D with just vertices and stuff. And then when you like Quake and it all goes 3D, and I'm like, I'm out. I don't have the time.
I remember using the Quake engine and it being pretty daunting. I didn't make a whole lot of progress with that. But Fear was made with Lithtech, which I don't remember. That may have actually been a branch off of the Quake engine. I can't remember.
I don't believe so. That was because that was Shogo, right?
Yeah. Was it just built internally? I can't even remember.
I believe
it might have just been rolled up from, because like even.
In fact, I think those. I think what you're thinking of is.
Yeah.
I wish I could think of the gentleman's name, but I think like the main programmer on that went to work at Valve after.
Okay.
Anyway, somebody will fact check us later.
But I found it, maybe it was just that I was at a different point. Maybe I was feeling more dedicated to it or whatever, but I kind of got over that, barrier with making levels for Fear. And
you got over your fear.
Yeah, I got over my fear of 3D level design.
It was real dumb. We'll edit that out. That's terrible.
We will not.
No, we will not. What? You clearly were a big fan of that game then, of Fear.
Yeah.
What was it about Fear? It was known for its really good AI.
Right.
What was it about that game that drew you in?
Well, I was a big fan of the No One Lives Forever games as well, and the same kind of creative director, writer created Fear, who had been in charge of the Nolf games. And so I was really excited for Fear when it was coming out, and also it was at that perfect time to have like Matrix, like bullet time and all of this kind of like very cool action kind of gunplay, but also coming from that studio, it had like a strong kind of story-based, narrative aspect to it, and they did the whole like, supernatural kind of like spooky, scripted jump scare kind of stuff. So I thought it was a really unique game at the time, and I was a fan of that team, and I just thought that, the combat encounters, the FPS stuff was like really great. But also they released their tools and all of the assets in the entire game so that basically you could theoretically make anything that they had put in the game yourself. And when I was looking at, if I want to make a level design portfolio, what tools am I going to use? I wanted to say, what's something that I can make, a story-based kind of like standalone thing and be able to kind of use what's there and use all those tools to make something of my own. Because a lot of, like the Valve tools are kind of similar, I think, in that they give you access to a lot of stuff in the game and everything that you can make with it. But the fear stuff, I think, I had a little bit more of a direct connection to like, oh, I could make something like that. I can like make some radio messages and put in some cool combat encounters and make a spooky little story and see if I can build that.
So you use that. You ended up, you got a job, pardon me, working at down in Houston with Timegate.
Yeah.
They were making a Fear expansion pack called Perseus Mandate. So was it surreal then to be then getting paid to be making Fear? Like you've been doing it on your own and putting stuff together, and now you're getting doing it professionally.
Yeah, it's my actual job. No, I mean it was really cool because that was one of those times where I think it's really valuable to be working on stuff because it is what you have a most direct connection to or kind of what you have the most enthusiasm for, as opposed to what's the most popular dev tools or what's the biggest game out there or whatever, right? Because people ask me about getting into games and starting as a designer, and I basically say to them that you need to be making stuff that you most want to be playing, Because if you're like, well, I don't really like, I'm not really like excited about what I can make with the Unreal Engine tools, but I know the Unreal Engine is popular, so I should do something with that. I think that people can learn tools, right? And a lot of places use their own internal tools that you can't even learn ahead of time, And so I think that it's way more valuable to be saying, I'm going to make stuff that's like what I want to play and the kind of games that I want to make professionally, no matter how I'm doing it, So like, if you're like, well, I can make a text adventure, but that's not really what I'm excited about, I would say figure out how to make what you're actually excited about, because that'll come through and that'll lead you more towards doing that thing, right?
And say that in our line of work too, write what you love.
Right.
Like that's totally universal advice.
Exactly. If you force yourself into some other mold, then you're not doing anybody any favors, right? And so with that, it was kind of especially true because hardly anybody really made maps or made mods for Fear, really. Like, I mean, there were people out there, but it was not as popular as as a lot of other mod tools or games. And so when I was making maps for Fear, and a studio that was making a Fear expansion pack needed a level designer to make maps for Fear, it was like, well, I can already do that. I don't have any experience. Like, I'm excited about it, but like, I can hit the ground running because I know how to do this already. I had a small studio who kind of needs to get this project done. They're like, all right, then you like get up in here, let's do this thing, right?
So you go to Houston. Are your parents stoked at that point because you've pursued this dream? I mean, I know you were doing the QA stuff at Sony, but now you're like, you're not just testing.
Right.
You're not just yanking memory cards out with the system on. You are you're in there.
Yeah, making stuff. I mean, the harder thing was, I had moved to Oregon. Yeah, when I was 19 and I had finished college there, and then my wife and I had moved down to San Francisco. So I was actually living here in San Francisco when I was doing the testing stuff. And so then I moved to Houston for like 6 months to ship that expansion pack. And so, in a way, it was, it was what I wanted to do, and I was glad I did it because it's like, I don't know necessarily when or how I'm going to get like a design job, especially not like an FPS level design job like I want at all anytime soon, who knows, right? But I have this opportunity now, and it was kind of hard because, I was still like, I was coming back to San Francisco to visit, and I wasn't getting paid a lot, and it was sort of like a long distance thing, and like it was a lot of kind of what ifs still, but it was really valuable to be able to say, like, if I go to Timegate and I do my best on this project and I, put good work into it, and I have kind of that resume line that says
shipped
one ship title
Yeah.
as a level designer, I can kind of bring that back with me and build from there.
And you did.
Yeah.
The opportunity did present itself. 2K Marin here in the Bay Area.
Right.
How does that come about? You end up on BioShock 2.
Yeah. Well, I actually met a couple of the guys from 2K Marin at GDC, the Game Developers Conference here in town, because I had been going to GDC for a couple of years before that already. I had been semi-scamming press passes via Idle Thumbs. If you know the Idle Thumbs podcast, it used to be a text article site, and so I wrote articles for them, and they got press passes for things like E3 and GDC via that site. So I had been going to that for a couple of years, just because I knew I wanted to get into game development, and there's such interesting talks and presentations at GDC, and you get to see the IGF pavilion where there's all these indie games.
That's probably the perfect place for a budding game developer
Yeah.
to be, is to just soak yourself at
Yeah.
GDC, right?
Yeah, well, and I was really lucky that we came here for my wife's grad school, so we just happened to be in a way, or we ended up in San Francisco, and so just being able to take the Muni to or the BART to Moscone Center and go to GDC was huge. But yeah, I was there, and some friends in the industry encouraged me to talk to the 2K Marin guys. It's funny, yeah, you end up forming really tight friendships with other people in the industry because you kind of come up together.
Sure.
I'm sure that you've talked to Greg Kasavin and Amir from Supergiant, and also Chris Remo is now at Campo Santo, and he was one of the founders of Idle Thumbs. But at the time, he was doing games journalism stuff. So I went to GDC. I had corresponded with Greg for years just because I was a fan of his. I actually interviewed him for a thing when I was still in college. So I met him for the first time at GDC, and he was like, if you're thinking of getting another level design job, you should talk to the 2K Marin guys. And I was kind of I don't know, why would they even, I've shipped one expansion pack and they're making BioShock, so why would they even, I never would have considered it, right? But he was like, you should do that. And then I was like, eh. And then Chris was going to interview Ken Levine at their booth for a game, for a Shack News interview. And he was like, I'm going to the 2K Marin booth, you want to come? And I was like, yeah, I get. And so then I showed up and talked to them, and really it was my friends in the industry who encouraged me to actually take the leap and kind of put myself out there in a way that I wouldn't have. And it all came from I was already at GDC.
Yeah.
I was there where the people were there. I could just kind of cross paths.
Yeah, the
with
lesson
them,
though clearly is, if you want to get somewhere in life, you can't just sit back and wait for a phone call.
Right.
You got to go get it. You're out there. You're scheming your way into GDC, and you're going out and getting it, basically.
Right. Yeah. It's so easy to talk yourself out of things. Obviously there's going to be other opportunities that you do go for, and they just aren't a match, or they don't work out, or nothing's guaranteed. But in that case, I had started from that assumption of well, they wouldn't be interested, and then actually having the push to say would you guys be interested, and then being yeah, we should totally talk more, send us an application, email me or whatever, it's that is the turning point that then maybe that opportunity actually can happen when it definitely wouldn't have otherwise.
Since you've already sort of said multiple times that you love story-based stuff, you're making story-based little mods and things with Fear, and so I take it you must have already been very much a fan of BioShock at that point. That
for sure.
game clearly had to gel with you, I would think.
And I loved System Shock 2, and so I had played the Freedom Force games and SWAT 4, and basically had been a huge fan of Irrational all the way up to BioShock. And then, I remember I was at Timegate and I played the Xbox demo of BioShock in the break room. It was one of those games where it's the demo for BioShock just came out, let's download it, and kind of the studio crowded around, and I drove that demo, and everybody kind of had that experience. And then whatever it was, 7-8 months later, I was working on the sequel, which is crazy. But that game had a huge impact on me, and the work that Irrational had done leading up to that game was just some of my favorite stuff in the industry. So yeah, it was a huge opportunity for sure.
So I'm curious, you ended up, I mean, you're kind of, from where I'm sitting, you may disagree, but it seems like your sort of career springboard really was Minerva's Den.
Yeah,
I don't know if you agree with that or not,
Yeah.
but so where did Minerva's Den come from? It's that was when DLC was just starting to become a regular thing with games as a way to sort of keep things going. I mean, I guess back in the day we called them, they were expansion
packs.
They were separate in another box.
I have expansion pack experience, I said, yeah.
But so was Minerva's Den already a thing kicking around that you just came in and took the reins on, or was that your baby start to finish?
It was inspired by some discussions that we had in the studio at 2K Marin, like during BioShock 2's development. I think one of the things that you kind of have to be good at when you're doing design work and story development work, because in games, story and mechanics and design they all talk to each other, right? And so I think that making connections between disparate concepts can add up into a single kind of like cohesive whole, but you have to be looking out for where that inspiration can come from. So we were working on BioShock 2, and I remembered, well, during my interview at 2K Marin, one of the interview pieces was like, pitch a level for BioShock that could have taken place, I forget, like between Fort Frolic and the next level, I guess that would be Hephaestus, the mechanical area. So like pitch a level that could be slotted into BioShock, and what would it be, and who would the character be, kind of your antagonist character, and what would the story be. So I had pitched the computer core of Rapture as a thing with like a guy who was kind of splicing to become smarter and see all the possibilities with math and stuff. So that was my kind of like, this would be a cool idea pitch during my interview. And so I think that was kicking around where I was like, well, if we want to make some DLC, what part of Rapture could we make? I had an idea for that. I remember this. And then I remember when I was in the design pit, when we were working on the main game, JP LeBreton, who was the lead level designer, he was just kind of telling a story about how he and the lead designer of BioShock 1 had been kind of just, can I swear on this?
Yeah, say whatever you want. Unfiltered.
Okay, yeah, that's true.
Randy Pitchford was in here, and dude was just like a sailor. It was great.
Unchained. So they were bullshitting and saying like, wouldn't it be cool if, with Rapture's advanced technology, if they had like created the original AI that sort of in the unspoken fan fiction had like led to the technology that ended up being like Shodan and System Shock 2. Like, wouldn't that be a cool idea or whatever? And so those two ideas, when the concept of, hey, we need to do story DLC after the main game came together, I was like, we should do the computer core of Rapture, and it can be about this kind of like steampunk AI that's created and kind of draw from those System Shock 2 ideas of like, spoilers, Shodan being able to like impersonate other people and kind of have multiple identities. And so, kind of like, I guess the last thing that I threw out there, I was fortunate enough to be given the opportunity to lead the DLC by Zach McClendon, who was the lead designer of BioShock 2. I think mostly because I had been a dedicated level designer and like done my work on the main game, but also I was one of, I think, the few people who was sort of like, hey, we're done with the main game. Well, I've got some ideas for DLC. Like, here's some, like, I think we could do this. I think that would be cool.
Again, going out there and getting it, right? You didn't just sit back and be like, okay, well, I'll wait to be told what to do next.
Yeah, it was more like, hey, if we're doing story DLC, here's some ideas. I'd like to hear your feedback on them or whatever. And I think it was just sort of one of those things where it's like, you want to do DLC, right? We need somebody to do it. Yeah, go for it. You're in. And it's like, it was a lot of responsibility. It was a huge opportunity to basically like be able to create like a small part of the kind of the fabric of Rapture's fiction.
Did you see it that way at the time, or?
What I saw it as was I needed to do something that felt like it lived up to the other games in the series. Something that felt like it fit with the tone and the fiction and like that world in a way that didn't feel like it kind of like broke the rest of the stuff around it, and also that if you played it, it would feel like, oh yeah, this is of the the quality level or the, this is of a kind of feeling that feels like this is BioShock
Belongs.
and not
Yeah.
just sort of like some other thing that's off to the side,
Did you see it? Like, did you have a master plan from day one, like that you wanted, like, oh, this gets me one step closer to being able to have my own studio and tell my own stories, or?
No, I wouldn't say so at all. Like, I perhaps to my detriment, I'm mostly only looking one step ahead, which is like, it means I'm not a good chess player. But it still means I'm sort of like, okay, level designer in BioShock 2, opportunity to make something cool, DLC, and then from
Keeps
there,
you focused.
Yeah, because you're not saying like, what am I going to be? I mean, having a 5-year plan is good, but also you're not saying like, well, whatever is happening here, what's most important is like 3 steps out. It's like this thing has to go well. So, after we completed the DLC, it was like, well, 2K Marin isn't making more BioShock. Irrational's making more BioShock. Irrational has been a huge inspiration to me. I shipped this DLC that people were excited about. Maybe I can work on the next, full title in the series. And similarly, skipping ahead a little bit, we didn't even move back to Portland saying like, we're going to do this to start, so I can start my own studio. It's like, we want to move back to Portland. We want to be there. Now, how do we do that? Well, I guess we need to start our own thing once we get there, But it has been mostly kind of like looking at what those possibilities are in front of us, and then seeing what to do, and just taking it one step at a time, I think.
Before I get to BioShock Infinite, which I do want to ask you about, what was your reaction when Minerva's Den came out to just huge critical acclaim? Like, I always like to ask developers, like, do you know you have something really good, or are you so just sort of tunnel vision in the moment that it's not till someone else can kind of come at it with a fresh perspective? So like, what was your reaction to the acclaim that it got?
Well, I mean, we made something that we thought came together and that we thought was cool. I mean, it was really interesting actually, because as far as where we went after this, I remember when we were working on the game, I had pitched like, you beat the last boss, and then you're going down into Porter's personal quarters, where it's like, just sort of a quiet space, his office and living space. And I pitched, like you go down the elevator and we just kind of take your guns away, and you just like walk around and look at the stuff. And I remember a couple people on the team were sort of like, oh, but the space is so cool. It would be great for combat. You should have some enemies in there. And I was like, I really think that after you've had your last big fight, you kind of need that quiet time.
Thank you. See, I appreciate that in games. I hate the gauntlet. I hate having to run a gauntlet at the end of a game where it's just like, well, how do we end this? Let's just throw everything that they've already seen at them, but like 4 of each, and make it really hard.
How about 700 dudes?
I like the wind down. I like the exhale.
Yeah, so I mean, we were like trying to invest in, that's going to be, a good ending experience, and it feels like there's something there. But when you're making it, I think you only have the perspective on, does it seem good? But you don't know if it's going to be like, people are really going to react to this, or is it going to be huge, or people, going to, you can hopefully tell if you're making something that's like hitting a certain quality bar, but how people are going to react is like never known. And I remember like the weekend before content lock, which is like when you're just like, we can't put any new things in the game, we just have to bug fix. I brought a test kit, a 360 test kit home, and had my wife play through the game, and I just sat next to her and took notes, and she played through the whole DLC, and I took like 10 pages of notes of just like, oh, that thing's in the wrong place, or whatever. And she got to the end, when it's like the final kind of like monologue that Porter is having, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna fix that, and I just looked over, and she was just like, and I was like, whoa, like I didn't see that coming, but seeing someone that I had this really, like she's my wife, like we've had, years of our lives together, and seeing that it had that kind of effect on her made me think like, whoa, maybe we've made something that, our people are going to be able to forge that kind of connection with. Yeah, and so then when it came out, it's DLC for a sequel. It's not like it got the huge round of like hundreds of reviews from all different outlets or whatever. But seeing that people said that, they were like, this feels like it fits with the best of the BioShock series and stuff like that. It's like, all right, great. Well, we did our job. It was really cool to see because, like, it's hard to get attention for any game, and it's hard to get attention for DLC, for a sequel, for, and I think at that time, we were at a really lucky time to kind of be coming out like with like the Mass Effect 2 DLC and the Red Dead Redemption DLC, and it was kind of a little bit of like a golden age for like, the single player DLC being high quality and people being excited about it. But yeah, seeing that it really kind of landed for people that were fans of BioShock, and that maybe, like BioShock 2 was such a complicated project to work on because it's sort of like BioShock felt like it was so, like, it was iconic as a thing, right? And I think that everybody, players and developers, felt that tension of like, well, how do you follow that up? Like, what is BioShock 2? And I think that there were kind of mixed takes on that when the game came out, and so seeing that people could take a chance on the DLC and kind of like be able to get into it on its own terms and kind of walk away with an emotional connection to it was like really, really cool.
So that does lead to BioShock Infinite.
Yeah.
You end up working with Irrational on it for a while.
Yeah, I was there for a year.
Well, I'm always curious. Ken Levine is one of my white whales for this show. Like, I would love to have him on here and interview him about his career
He hates
sometime.
traveling. He almost never like goes to things.
He's earned the right. He's like Todd Howard's another one. You got to come to him.
Todd's just like, nah.
The Todd father. You got to come to him.
I've never heard that, but now I can never unhear it.
That's fine.
I'm gonna think it every time I see him.
Yeah, that's fine. I love him. I've interviewed him a million times, just not here like this. But anyway, so the point of that whole stupid aside on my part was, what's Ken Levine like to work for? Especially, you're saying, you were just such a fan of Irrational. You played, System Shock 2 onwards. So what's it like when you go and you're working for Ken?
I mean, I was really lucky to have, to even have the opportunity to like work directly with him a lot because, like, you got a big studio.
Sure.
Not everybody actually gets a lot of FaceTime or whatever, right? But when I was working on Infinite, I was a senior level designer, which in my case basically meant writing level design documents and level design pitches, and then talking through them with Ken and a group of other senior people at the studio, but mostly kind of like pitching level design docs to Ken based on the requirements of like, the main story beats and what mechanics need to be introduced and all that kind of stuff. And so I really got to learn a lot from, going to Ken and kind of being like, here's my ideas for solutions to these design problems. Like, kind of hear the specific details of what happens between these major points, and being able to see what his and like Nate Wells and Steven Alexander, what all of their perspective was on like me being like, what if we did this? And then being like, well, maybe some of that, but here and here and here are the things that we think about when we're saying like, what are we going to put in an Irrational game? What's going to speak to players the way that we want to, or what are the other kind of like factors that, as somebody with less experience, you don't have in mind when you're like, what if we did this? And so, Ken and I worked really well together, and we still, keep up with each other and stuff. I visited him when I was in Boston last year, or earlier this year. I feel really lucky to have gotten to kind of have that experience of not just working at Irrational, but getting to actually kind of be exposed to a lot of Ken and the other kind of like senior Irrational guys' experience that came from, Ken was the writer and one of the main designers on the early stages of the original Thief, and then System Shock 2, and then all the games, and then BioShock, and being able to say like, I was able to contribute to that project, but also to actually like learn about the mindset and where those games came from was something I'm really, really grateful for.
And Infinite ended up, was in development for a while. Is there anything of concrete of yours that we would recognize in the final product?
I mean, I am lucky to be able to say that a bunch of the stuff that I, like spec'd out early made it into the game in the final form, that the actual like dev team that spent that last like year and a half like making it real built. The main level that I was responsible for was Finkton, which is the kind of factory town where, they kind of introduced going through the tears into different versions of the universe to kind of get the one that they were looking for. So a lot of the kind of like beats that I built in ended up getting actually turned into a real video game by the rest of the team that like crunched super hard to make that a reality. But it was one of those super interesting experiences to work on a game in some of its formative stages for like a solid year, and then leave like a year and a half before the game comes out, and then play the finished product and be like, oh, they kept that in, but that's totally different, and this level didn't even used to be here at all, and they switched these things around, but that's still there, and kind of like all of it, it's a really surreal experience to play through something like that, because as a developer, you leave a year and a half before the game comes out, you pretty much expect you're going to be like, well, none of the stuff I put in is going to be there, right? And to be fair, last time I had seen any of those levels, they were just like gray boxes, with like really super sketched in stuff. But how much was recognizable and how much you could compare directly because there's recognizable stuff and new stuff and different stuff was like super fascinating because you usually, I think, don't get to have that kind of perspective on something that you work on.
Yeah. So if I may ask, why leave? Why was it just time to get back to Portland at that point?
I mean, like honestly, it kind of was. Like I had worked on Infinite for a year, and I knew it was gonna be another good year plus before it came out, and my wife and I had never lived in like New England before. Boston was like kind of a new and different experience for us. Having multiple feet of snow on the ground for like 5 months a year was
Florida
like
guy
a new
over
thing.
here.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even Oregon, it's like rainy and gray, but you aren't like, how is this snow still here? It's May, piled up next to the road. But like, I think aside from all of that, the biggest thing was I was just sort of like, I got to that point where I was working on Infinite, and it was such a huge production, and I just realized that I was like, I don't think that I want to work on stuff that's this huge anymore. Like it's such a giant ship, like turns really slowly. There's so many dependencies on everything that happens that, I think that looking at it and saying, am I going to ship this game? Like, am I going to be here for the next year and a half, however long it takes to like get this thing out the door? And if I don't feel confident in that, the responsible thing to do is just say, all right, I don't think that I can be here for ship, so I've just got to like make a clean break now. Because in a lot of cases in development, if you leave 6 months before the game comes out, you're putting the rest of the team in a way worse place than if you leave early enough so they can find somebody to replace you and have them have time to like spin up and become productive before things really get hairy and all that kind of stuff. So, I had kind of done that year, felt good about what I'd been able to contribute, recognized that this wasn't a game that I was going to be able to like stick it out through the end for various reasons, and also my wife and I were homesick for the Pacific Northwest, so it was just kind of time.
Is there a part of you though that goes, man, I could have, if I can stick this out, I can have BioShock Infinite on my resume, and then maybe I can do like maybe that opens more doors for me, right?
I mean, I think that would be a factor if I was in that position of saying that, like, yeah, I want to like keep working on bigger and bigger stuff. If I looked at a game like Infinite and I was like, I want to be in charge of something like this someday, then I could totally see that. But at that time, I was like, this is just way too big, right? Like this is the summer blockbuster of games, and I having gone back to Portland and started my own thing. It's like similar right now. In what we're doing and going into the future, I don't have any perspective of like, all right, well, I want to build this into like 20 people and then 60 people and 100 people and then like, making something that, like you were saying, is like a $50 million production or something. It's more like we want to make stuff on a scale that we feel like we can all, basically kind of like we can all fit in one room and we can make stuff that we believe in. And there's various ways to work at that scale. But going down the other end of the road and being like, I don't know. leading a team of like 100, 200 people is not something that appeals to me.
Yeah, you saw
overall,
your version
I don't know, yeah.
that version of your future,
Right.
and
Yeah, well,
you processed it.
And I don't, and like, like life is long, hopefully, careers are long, hopefully. I guess that I'm not going to say that the person I am in 10 years or something it isn't the guy that's like, you know what, actually making a big blockbuster game would be awesome, right? But at that point, I was sort of like, this isn't the ladder I want to keep climbing,
So if in 10 years we're
Yeah.
playing Gone Home 3, the open world multiplayer cooperative blockbuster, then we'll pull this clip.
Yep, just go back to the tape. Didn't he say something about that?
No, so
It's 2027.
So where you go home, you set up shop. It's maybe just now clicking for me, literally gone home.
Yep.
Was the game idea born out of that? Out of that sort of return to where you wanted to be? And
right. I think it kind of had to be subconsciously in some ways. Like I think that the conscious side of it was saying, okay, we are a few people that have worked together on the BioShock series. We know about making these kind of first-person experiences and this kind of audio diary-based storytelling method and all that kind of stuff. So if we want to make something small, and if we want to make something that doesn't have any combat in it, you don't have to say, like, who am I fighting, who am I killing?
Right.
We could make something that's just about, we could make something that's about anything, right? Like, you could make a game like Gone Home that's in a medieval castle or a space station or kind of take your pick. But at that time, we were like, there's nothing that says we can't make a game like this just about a family and you're exploring their house to find out who they are and what happened to them. And so going from there, it's like, okay, well, let's set it in Oregon. It's where we are. Let's set it in, the 90s. Again, that's for like mechanical reasons consciously, which is we don't want cell phones, we don't want email. But subconsciously, it's like, that's when we were teenagers. And like, drawing on those experiences of kind of, like leaving the place that you're used to and ending up somewhere that you think you want to be and putting it through that lens of a smaller experience like that, I think was totally influenced in part by, the circumstances of actually making it.
Does the term walking simulator piss you off?
No,
you're good with it? Because I've seen it sort of, I've seen it used maliciously,
right.
And I've also seen it used totally innocently, too.
Right, it's one of those things where it clearly came from a place of being like, being dismissive about it, right? Yeah. Like, this is just a walking simulator. But the flip side of it is, like, you never get to choose what terms are used for your work, Like, hardly anybody gets to say, like, call this genre of work this, and then it takes off. Like, I guess sometimes it happens, but most of the time it's kind of like the audience or the critics or the people out in the world are the ones that say, well, this thing doesn't really have a name, so here's a name for it, and it might come from one place and end up just being a term that people understand, that kind of loses its initial connotations or whatever. I think that what is meaningful about it is just that it's an acknowledgement that this is sort of a kind of game that hasn't really been done before in a lot of ways, right? It's sort of, there's this new subgenre of, you're like, well, it's like a first-person shooter, but there's no shooting. It's a story game, but not like a, RPG, like dialogue tree story game. It's like about, what is this thing, right? And it has a name, and so that's useful.
And I love it too because I've been so lucky to get to sit here as a games media guy for 15 years now, and I've seen the pendulum swing. There's always a pendulum swing, right? Like, went from competitive shooters to cooperative shooters. Now it's kind of come back to competitive shooters a bit, and like, I feel like I've seen too the story be important in the System Shock days, BioShock, and then it kind of swung away from like, well, just it's pure action, who cares about the story?
Right.
And I feel like the walking simulator is kind of the pendulum swing back that we've seen now towards, well, no, the story is all that matters, and we're going to make we're going to make a subgenre that's just that.
Yeah. Well, and some of it I think is something that's interesting about working in game development and game design is that it's an ongoing dialogue, right? Where you as a designer are looking at other games, other designers' work, and they're looking at what you do, and everybody is kind of, referring to these design problems that are being slowly solved or addressed. And I think that, we got to a point where people were like, well, we can use some of these tools. We can use some of these established ideas or ways of playing a game, but apply them to a different kind of focus. We can take like what is established in first-person shooters and from like environmental storytelling in those kinds of games and focus it so that's like the point of the game.
Right.
I think that similarly with like the first season of The Walking Dead at Telltale, they were able to say, we're going to take a lot of the core components of a classic point-and-click adventure game, but we're going to remove a bunch of it.
Yeah.
And we're going to focus it on how can this be about an emotional journey for these characters and making hard decisions, as opposed to about solving, complex three-part
they've been making those
puzzles,
games for a long time and gone, kind of under the radar a bit. And
and I think there's something generational about it too, because Jake Rodkin and Sean Vanneman, who are the founders of Campo Santo, who made Firewatch, they were the leads on the first season of Walking Dead. And then similarly, I worked on the BioShock series, and then we made Gone Home. And I think that there's this generational aspect of being able to say, like, I grew up playing these games, but I didn't grow up making these games. And I grew up playing these games and a lot of other games, and I can kind of have that outside perspective on, well, these parts of a classic point-and-click adventure game could be applied to something that other games normally talk about and become this new thing. If we say, like, you don't have to have complicated inventory puzzles, you can just have these other things, that come from that and build it into something new. And I think that similarly saying, we can take experiences like System Shock or BioShock and kind of combine them or reassess them through the lens of, like, the story side of classic adventures, or this version of kind of a synthesis, I guess, of different kinds of games and kind of subsets of different parts of different kinds of games to turn it into something that hasn't quite been done before. And, I think you look at Firewatch and you see it is a combination between a first-person adventure and this kind of dialogue tree, Walking Dead, like dynamic character building, that it comes from kind of having access to that whole palette and seeing, like, what can we remove, what can we add. When I was working on Gone Home, something that I thought about, was like, okay, you've got like a BioShock style game, you have a first-person exploration game, but there are other games that I've played where you find things in the environment that tell you part of the story, and so, like, things as disparate as, like, System Shock 2, or not System Shock 2, Silent Hill 2, were an influence to me, where you find a note and you see, a physical, like, rendering of the handwritten note,
right.
And you're gathering so much about the environment and the tone and the mood from finding these things and being able to kind of say, like, what if we took that, and overlaid it on this and kind of turned it into something that all supported that core experience that you want the player to have through these means, as opposed to coming from, like, what are the requirements of the genre first, and how do we fulfill those, and then what do we do with it? It's more like, how do we take all these different things that the ongoing design dialogue have brought together?
You're making your own rules rather than just sticking to the template, basically.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you're probably starting from a template, right?
Yes.
And then you're, like, saying, well, what if this, and this we can pull out because they don't actually support this other aspect of it, and this thing from a Japanese survival horror game, and this thing from and you can kind of say, and if we integrated those, that would all kind of bring the player closer to this central experience that we think all these things are kind of pointing at.
Well, on that note, there's something I've been wanting to ask you ever since I played Gone Home, which is, did you mean for it to be part horror game? Because this is no joke. I'm not just kissing your butt since you're here. That game, Gone Home, is the scariest non-horror game I've ever played in my life. Like, and I love that about it. Like, was that on purpose?
It was it was on purpose after a point, if you know what I mean. So a lot of what we did with Gone Home was really predicated on, like I was kind of saying, like consciously about like mechanical requirements, which
Yeah.
are like, okay, we need to, for instance, we need to keep you inside of this house. Like you can't just leave, and we need you to not just call the cops, right? And we need you not to just be able to turn on the TV and like, why can't I flip through the channels on the TV? And so, you know, we were like, okay, well, maybe it's at night and there's a huge thunderstorm outside. That's why you can't go outside. That's why the phones are out. That's why there's no TV reception. Okay. And so now we're like, also we've made this big sprawling Victorian mansion because that more supports a kind of BioShock type like hall and room, you know, level construction, which we're also relying on for kind of laying out the audio diaries and everything. And so now we're like, okay, you're in a big creaky old mansion in the middle of the night during a thunderstorm, like,
And there's no one around.
right, yeah, like you're totally stranded there. And so we're sort of like, okay, all of those things point towards there's going to be a zombie or a serial killer or something, right? It's like it's very Resident Evil, right?
Yes.
Like the Resident Evil, you couldn't go out the front door because there was a three-headed dog out there. But like taking one step back from that, you're still in this mysterious, empty mansion at night, and so it was less of saying, let's start from we're gonna set this up like a horror game and then really flip people's expectations. It was more, oh, we're building something that really is saying to the player it's a horror game. And so now we have to be conscious of that, and we have to do things that will guide them away from that and towards where we want it to end up,
Yes.
right? And kind of acknowledge, okay, we know what you're seeing, we know that you're like nervous about this, which is good because I think that's how Katie, the player character, would have also felt in that situation. There's sort of a good overlap there. But it was also our job to say, by the time you get to the end, you're no longer playing because you're waiting to find the serial killer that's going to jump out. It's just because you care about this family and what happened to them, and that's what brings you through to the end.
So, Gone Home touches on coming-of-age issues that I have to imagine really resonated with a lot of people that played the game. What were some of the more kind of memorable emails or tweets you got from people that really connected with it?
I mean, there were really... That's something that's interesting about shipping a game like Gone Home is that people did have really, really personal connections to it. I mean, there were people who talked about how, you know, they had a close friend or a sibling that, you know, came out when they were younger and that they, you know, wrote us to say, I really felt like playing Gone Home gave me more perspective on what they would have been going through. It made me, or even just like, it brought me back to that time and it made me remember, you know, what it was like to be around them when they were dealing with these things. You know, there were people that said, you know, I am that older sibling who was away and couldn't be there for, you know, my brother or my sister when they were having this really hard time. And I felt those like pangs of being like, oh, Katie wasn't there either, and like how painful it was to know that, you know, you couldn't be the support that they needed when they were going through whatever they were going through. I mean, it was really interesting because there was at least one or two people who wrote and said like, you know, I don't know any gay people. I've never really had a lot of sympathy for, you know, I've been kind of against gay marriage or whatever, and playing Gone Home made me feel like I got to know this character as a person, and it really kind of made my perspective on that different. It kind of changed my mind on how I felt about those issues. And all that stuff is really valuable in terms of, you know, if you're making entertainment or if you're making art and it can actually make people reflect on their own personal experience or the experience that people actually know in life, or just how they kind of empathize with whoever, you know, with someone else's you know, perspective. I think that, you know, that is something that you can really only kind of like hope could ever happen.
Yeah, you've
know?
succeeded at that point as an artist, as a creator, have you not?
I mean, I think that there's this level of, you want to make something that's like entertaining and fun, but also make something that if somebody feels like it can kind of enrich their own perspective or make them kind of be reflective about experiences that they've had, then that's kind of all you can ask for. Yeah.
So again, I mean, Gone Home was really that was real breakout success in the sense that that's when Fulbright. Okay.
Right. Sure.
I mean,
yeah.
So were you surprised at all at just how well it was received and how well it did?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we rented a house in Portland and we made that game in our basement. And we wanted to make something that would feel like it was worth playing, and we wanted to make something that would feel like it had value to it, that people would be like, oh wow, I'm really glad I played that, right? But the level of reaction that it had, especially like the positivity of the reviews and how many people played it and kind of shared their experiences with it, and just the degree to which it was kind of a defining moment for like a lot of people, I think, at that time, was something that we never would have or could have predicted, that we just kind of had to be like, oh, what you try to do is like make something that people will think is good and hopefully they'll like buy it so you can keep making stuff. But when you are fortunate enough to actually kind of have one of those moments where it's the thing that people are talking about and it's the thing that people are sharing their experiences about, you just kind of have to be there for it, right? You can't predict that. You can't like make that happen. I mean, maybe if you're like Blizzard and you're making Overwatch, you can kind of be like, all right, we're gonna make this thing huge, right? But when you make a game just with a few people in your basement and then it's something that has that level of reaction, I think you just kind of have to like take it as it comes.
So on that exact note, did you feel an immense amount of pressure to figure out what to do next, which, that's ultimately Tacoma. Like,
yeah.
how did you land on that?
Well, we wanted to, I think that something that we wanted to do is push forward from the way that we were telling stories, right? Because having worked on BioShock and Minerva's Den and then Gone Home, I think we were very familiar with that shape of storytelling, that kind of like you're moving through a space and you're finding these audio diaries and you're putting it back together. And we really wanted to push ourselves to say, we can't just rely on setting this game in a particular time. We can't say like, what if it's in 2002? What if it's in 1994? We want to push ourselves into a futuristic setting where we have to build more of that universe. And we want to involve the player more directly with these moments that the character is experiencing while they happen, while also putting them in that role of an active investigator who's kind of like digging through those details and playing that role in a very kind of like intentional way that you feel like, oh, okay, I'm experiencing everything that's here through how I play and what I do. And we took inspiration from immersive theater, specifically Sleep No More, which is a production that's done in New York that is about being in this physical environment while the actors move around you and you can follow them and they split off and you kind of have to see it from one perspective and then come back and see it from another one. But to build that into this kind of like natively digital experience where instead of following actors in a physical space, you can kind of move that timeline and interact with it as the player. And so, I think that we wanted to say, we established kind of a lot with Gone Home, and not just to say, we're just going to do another one of those, but say like, how do we take what we did with that and build another layer on it that feels legitimate and feels like something that pushes what we do forward and that people will, again, kind of feel like they haven't played something like this before.
So you kind of started over in the middle of development with Tacoma, and I only know this because there was a point where you came out here to show some of the media, the game, and it was still a space station,
right?
But the aesthetic was totally different.
Yeah.
You had this in-game fiction. I remember, like, I'm a big Tesla fan. You'd set up Virgin Tesla as this mega corporation that was sort of like the biggest company on the planet that was like integrated into the fiction of the game. So tell me about that version and why you guys ultimately decided to pivot away from it.
Well, I think some of it was, as much as we were trying to move away or to make the experience we were building feel legitimately different from Gone Home, we had still stuck with too many of our assumptions about it. Like, kind of the shape of how you moved through the game was still very much based on Gone Home. And we had the AR figures in the game, but they were much more isolated. They were much more kind of like almost just a visual audio diary. You know, we've all seen in a lot of games stuff where there's sort of like a hologram talking to you, but it could be audio, really. And so when we got to that point, we just realized that we were not going as far as we needed to, and that the game that we were making contained ideas that were kind of being pointed towards. Like, the idea was there, but we need to do more with it. And so I think that was the turning point where we said, how do we not just have these AR figures be there while you're hearing this little story moment? How do we make them be like what the game is about? You know, how do we say that the station, because one of the things about the station in the original version, it was like you were saying, the aesthetic was very like large and kind of sweeping. You know, there were these huge spaces which you could kind of propel yourself through because it was anti-gravity, but it was zero gravity, but you were kind of moving between surfaces, and like that was theoretically cool, but it didn't support kind of what we do as storytellers in our games, which is to make these kind of very relatable environments where you feel like you're like, oh, I can see what happened here. I can see how this person was living. And so at that point, we had to say, okay, we're going to make this, you know, small, like bring the scale of the spaces in, reconstruct the station so that where the characters live, it's actually gravitized, so you can have those moments of like, oh, somebody dropped their, you know, shoes on the floor here or whatever. And also make the AR scenes, which are the characters kind of having these 3D recordings of what happened to them, be more expansive and kind of move around you, and for you not just to be watching them, but to be interacting with them. Again, so that your relationship to those characters in those moments are like the core of the game and what it's about in a new and unique way, instead of just being kind of like a couple of additional, you know, strokes on top of what we had already done.
Yeah. And it totally worked. It really is. I'm loving the game so far. I'm in the middle of it still, which bad interviewer, didn't finish the game before the guest came in. But you know,
I don't hold it against
I
you.
appreciate it. You can.
I'm glad what you like. I'm
later.
glad that you like what you've played so far.
No, I really do, and it's. I just love the idea, the premise of being able to experience a story from sort of multiple perspectives.
Right.
I mean, it does feel like a step forward in the storytelling way. So I think everybody should check it out. And so the Tacoma we did get with these AR projections that you can fast forward, rewind through. Great reviews. Are you a developer? Do you pay attention to reviews? Do you care?
I mean, you kind of have to, right? Like,
not necessarily. You could be a total auteur and just say, "Here's my game," and I'm never looking at a review. And then, that's why I like to ask.
That's true. No, I mean, I totally look at reviews. I think it's important to kind of know what is resonating with people, you know, and to know what parts of the experience you're building, you know, click with people, and what. I think something that's interesting about reviews is kind of it talks about what expectations people had that they brought with it, as well as their reaction to the thing for itself, and just so seeing, you know, it's a considered perspective on what you made, and I think that, you know, making commercial entertainment means you have to be thinking both about like what's my perfect artistic vision for, you know, what I would do with no constraints, and also how is the audience going to react to this? Like, how are people going to, you know, like how are they going to connect to this experience or not? And so, you know, I totally am how do I put this? I value reading like reviews because they're like a well thought out analysis in a lot of cases of sort of like, here's what we put in the game, and here's what we meant to put in the game, and here's what we meant for people to get out of the game, and how did that come across to people who are spending time with it and kind of sharing their own experience on the other end.
So before I let you go, you've mentioned Ken Levine. I'm curious, like who are some game designers out there that you look up to? Because we've just spent an hour or more talking about your journey up through the ranks, and you've gone out and you've earned it.
Right.
So who are some game designers out there that you either connect with personally or you really look up to and admire their work?
Yeah.
I'm always curious to ask that.
I mean, I definitely, Ken was a huge inspiration for sure, and Tim Schafer, like Full Throttle is one of the most important games to me that I've played.
A fellow person is Full Throttle your favorite Tim Schafer game too?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
You can stay.
Okay. Yeah. I mean that game did so much at that time that was so unique. Visually, it had like the full screen like cutscenes that were just like amazing to play in 1995. But also fictionally, it was, as far as being an influence on my work, it was such a personal story. It was like, you were a biker and there was this sort of noir kind of like murder mystery to it, but also it was just about a few people and what they wanted and what they were going through in a way that, felt totally unique and really felt, like just so, there was a real humanity to that game that I think, struck me. Because I played that game when it came out. I was a huge fan of Maniac Mansion and the Monkey Island games and Sam & Max and all.
I knew I liked you.
and I subscribed to The Adventurer, the LucasArts newsletter, and so I played Full Throttle when it came out, and it's one of those games that I keep coming back to because I'm just like those characters, Ben and Maureen and Corley, Malcolm Corley are all just so like well drawn and perform in it.
So I cut you off there in the middle. I had to nerd out on Full Throttle. So Ken and Tim Schafer.
Yeah, and people like. I'm not like, on the one hand, I'm not a huge like strategy game player as far as like it's not my like genre that I'm hardcore into. Yeah. But I have such respect for Sid Meier for having created so much with such consistency, like at Firaxis over all these years. They're the people who inspire you creatively that you're like, I want to make stuff like that. And there's people who are like, man, what you've done in the industry and how you've been able to like, like create not just any individual game, but sort of that, what something like Firaxis is really inspiring, just to see somebody who's like, I've been around for 30 years, and I make, I got this studio, we make great stuff, we do things on the terms that we work on. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Shinji Mikami. Just Resident Evil is like one of my, the original Resident Evil and Resident Evil 4 are like two of my favorite games, and the range that you can see between those two games, of being like Resident Evil really established survival horror games, and then Resident Evil 4, very different, but like so masterful. And then playing games like Vanquish and like God Hand, and seeing how much of just a consummate designer of all these different experiences one person can be, is a huge inspiration as well. I mean, on the Sid Meier front, kind of like playing, so I just shipped a game. I don't know if we mentioned this, but I didn't get around to playing Zelda, the new Zelda, Breath of the Wild, until like just a few weeks ago. But
now you come at it with all these expectations. Then everybody says,
everybody is
so
like game of the year, which it seems like it so far. But thinking about someone like Miyamoto as well, who similarly is like has just been doing great work for so long in so many different ways, between like helping guide the hardware at the studio and kind of overseeing an experience like Breath of the Wild, or directly designing Wii Sports, or like all of these ways that someone can have this presence over so many years and decades is really inspiring. Because I think that as a developer or as a designer, or I assume as like a novelist or a film director, or like take your pick, as a creative person, I think you want to hope that you can continue doing work that's worthwhile as your life, you know, not
Yes.
just as like, oh, I made that one thing, you know, like that was cool, but you know, like I think that no work really stands in total isolation, and so I think you can have inspiring works. You know, I can look at like Maniac Mansion, which I played when I was a kid, and which is about a teen going into a mansion, and like you know, like I feel like that had an influence on Gone Home as much as anything else. But also look at someone like Ron Gilbert, not just being like I made Maniac Mansion, but being like I've been part of this industry and kind of worked on Monkey Island and then started his own studio to make like the Pajama Sam games
Yes.
and all that stuff and
basically pioneered edutainment,
right.
effectively.
Yeah. So, I think you can be inspired by individual games or individual works or kind of someone's design aesthetic or what they bring to the games that they make, but also these people who have been able to really build a life in the games industry over time. As someone who, is trying to kind of, emulate that is really inspiring as well.
All right, well, Steve Gaynor's not here for his health. He's not here. He's had to endure an hour plus with me to promote Tacoma,
Yeah.
which is your latest game, PC, Xbox One,
Yeah.
Maybe other platforms in the future. I suspect you want as many people someday to get
Yeah,
at it as possible.
We definitely want as many people as they can to play Tacoma, but yeah, right now it's on Steam, GOG, it's on our homepage, and you can play it Windows, Mac, Linux, or Xbox One.
Yeah, do check it out for sure, and all of Steve's work. We just heard everything. We heard the life story. No, that was fascinating to me, Steve. Thank you so much for coming in.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was great to talk to you about
this was an absolute pleasure. So for much more from the great minds like Steve Gaynor, those who've worked hard and gone out and you went out. You did. You went out and got it. I mean, that's the thing. People always ask, like, oh, I want to do this thing. I was like, well, go do it. You got to go get it. And that's your story over the last hour is just proof positive once again. So, Steve, thank you so much. For more on the best, brightest, most fascinating minds in the games industry, tune back for a new episode of IGN Unfiltered every month.